We appealed to all parties to say, please go back to the table and make sure that you engage robustly, but also honestly. Don't just follow the process because it's a compliance matter. Make sure that everything that we do is in the interest of SABC. The last one, of course, talks to the development of a proposal for populating the structure that considers viable options such as retraining, as I said, early retirement and voluntary severance packages. These are the things that are entailed, and even when you engage with the unions themselves, they have a full appreciation of that. But all they are saying is that we need to know who has what in SABC and what does SABC need in the new structure, so that we do not go and get new resources if we understand that there are people that can be upskilled within, because we may end up having to reduce the number that must be cut off. This is the message that we've been hammering both to the board, to Parliament and the public, to say, yes, we understand that SABC is in a financial crisis. And of course, these are things that must be followed. But there are proposals that are being made, which is why we ask for consideration of other alternatives that can make sure that SABC remains functional, but most importantly, relevant and productive. Because that's very important. As we engage with the unions also, it's not just about saying we don't want retrenchments. No. Ourselves as the shareholder representatives are not union leaders to say, no, don't go for this part. Ours is to make sure that the organizational is functional and productive and responsive to its mandate. Therefore, when we look at the challenges that are faced by the organization, we look at them holistically.
A very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Unfiltered on SABC 3 as well as SABC News Channel 404. I'm Simpiwe Ngongwane, standing in for my colleague Alden Sampier. Now, as the crisis at the SABC intensifies, now NGOs are calling for an overhaul of the public broadcaster's current funding model, which they say is inadequate for the public broadcaster to deliver successfully on its public mandate. Millions of South Africans rely on the SABC for news and entertainment, especially much-needed content in mother tongue languages. Currently, the SABC's revenue streams include a 5% government grant, 15% comes from public funding through licenses and advertising accounts, and for some, 80% of the revenue. Now, public broadcasters across Europe, including the BBC and Deutsche Welle in Germany, are funded wholly by their governments. SABC employees, as we've been seeing for the past few weeks, have picketed at its offices across the country, demanding, amongst other things, a retraction of letters given to some workers. All eyes will be on Parliament tomorrow when it holds a special debate on the future of the public broadcaster. And tonight we ask you, is the government failing in its constitutional mandate to fund the SABC? Remember, you can join this discussion via our social media platforms using the hashtag SABC News and at SABC News Unfiltered, as well as hashtag Unfiltered. Our guest this evening is SABC COO Ian Plakkies, William Bird, who is the Director of Media Monitoring Africa. We also have the Deputy Chairperson of Save SABC, SOS Mpondaba, as well as IFP National Spokesperson Mkhuleko Hlengwa. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Unfiltered.
Good evening.
Mkhuleko, I'm going to start with you. What really prompted the Inkatha Freedom Party, to request a parliamentary debate on the SABC?
Well, there's a crisis. That's fundamentally why we need to have this discussion. We need to pull it out of the shadows and place all the material facts on the table, some of whom you've already alluded to. And the irony, of course, in the insert you started off with from the Minister of Communications, saying that they are urging the SABC and the stakeholders to do A, B, C, and D. Yet ultimately, the public mandate at the SABC is unfunded. Government is giving SABC between 3 and 5%, and yet nobody is speaking about the impact of this on the commercial ventures of the SABC, which it has to undertake. The retrenchments are part and parcel of the bailout conditions which National Treasury gave to the SABC. Therefore, it begs the question as to whether government is singing from its own hymn sheet and walking its own talk, or is it talking from both sides of its mouths? The impasse here arises out of a failure and a lack of leadership on the part of the, excuse me, the SABC shareholders, which is government. The second point is that retrenchments are not a silver bullet to the SABC problems. Yes, they are part and parcel of the solutions which have to be effected as part of the restructuring of the SABC for it to meet its demands. But what is actually of fundamental concern to us is that the board is being left to its own devices to enforce conditions of the bailout, which have been imposed by the very shareholder, which is government. Therefore, those contradictions have now had the board and management on one hand and the employees of the SABC at loggerheads. It remains our fundamental belief that government has not interacted with this matter in good faith and is actually engineering the crisis. The third point is there have been calls for the dissolution of the board, which we certainly do not believe are correct because we cannot appoint boards for situational realities. The board is finding itself at a point where its options are fast running out, but at the same time, there are other intricacies in its own work which can still be actually explored. The final point which has prompted us to have this debate is the threat which this has to national stability, because the SABC is the source of information for everybody. And therefore, a risk of a blackout poses serious challenges for South Africa. And therefore, this is a debate, as we are saying, that has to be pulled out of the shadows, and we need to place all the facts on the table. And therefore, the IFP is also making the call that the board and the workers can no longer have a discussion with themselves only or engage on themselves only. There is a need for a independent mediator or a consultancy to bring these parties together, because the concerns of workers remain legitimate if you look at the fact that they speak about consultation, which they believe has not been adequate. We have to explore all those options. So the board in this matter and management cannot be a player and a referee in a matter which in itself may affect them as well, because they also receive remuneration from the SABC. So what we are calling for really is an honest discussion about the SABC matters, so that nobody speaks from a subjective point of view, but we have to place the facts and realities on the table and make informed decisions which are going to save the SABC. Ultimately, this is about ensuring that the SABC remains alive and that it's able to fulfill, on one hand, its public mandate, but also at the same time to fully exploit the prospects of its commercial ventures.
And having said that, Mkhuleko, you made quite a valid point there in terms of ensuring that the SABC, keeps up on its public mandate. And who is responsible then to ensure that the SABC is funded adequately? And in the same breath, do you think it's time that the SABC starts re-looking and rethinking its revenue-generating mechanisms?
Of course it has to. The fact that they are reliant on TV licenses and on advertising, amongst others, in comparison to what other international players are doing, that's a drop in the ocean. But also at the same time, we have to look at the revenue, the expenditure patterns of the SABC. About 43% of its expenditure is on salaries. And so those disparities in total are what have landed us in an impasse. If you look at also, then there's other issues about the financial management, there's issues of corruption, wasteful and irregular expenditure, which come into the mix. And so that is why we are saying retrenchments on their own are not a silver bullet. They have to form part and parcel of a broader composite intervention, which speaks about cost-cutting measures across the spectrum on one hand. But government cannot speak of a public mandate, yet it is only giving SABC 3% of its income. And so that is where the difficulty is. I think, Simpiwe, the missing voice in all of this, wrongly so, is the voice of National Treasury, which set the terms and conditions for the bailout. We are yet to hear what National Treasury has to say about this matter. A shareholder is not a shareholder by name. It's shareholder through investment, pumping in resources, infrastructure, and so on. And so the decision has to be made. Is the SABC a public entity, or is it a private business venture which has got characteristics of a public mandate. Because if those are the tough decisions we have to take, then we must do so insofar as a public-private partnership at the SABC is concerned. This matter is very, very complex, and it must not be dealt with in an irrational manner, which is a knee-jerk reaction or a shotgun approach. Its implications go far beyond just the issues of retrenchments, but they speak about national security and national stability, risk which we cannot afford to take lightly.
Mr. Plakis, let me also bring you into this conversation. The IFP is quite adamant that retrenchments are a silver bullet in the whole conversation. And you, together with your colleagues and as well as the entire board at SABC, have become very, very unpopular figures over the past few weeks. And you've been subjected to much vitriolic attacks. And I mean, one then wonders why the SABC is so adamant with retrenchment when everybody is saying that retrenchments should come as a last resort.
Thanks, Mpiwe. And just a correction, Colette said that retrenchment wasn't a silver bullet. And everything he said, I fully agree with 100%. And it isn't a silver bullet. It is just one of the aspects of our turnaround strategy. So if you look at the SABC, besides the funding model, we do have a bloated structure. There is no other way of dealing with a bloated structure. The unintended consequences of a bloated structure is you have employees who do not have meaningful roles, and you have employees, and if you find work for them, it builds on and increases a value chain, basically. So our customers complain and say that it's very difficult doing business with us because of our business processes. And so we've got to streamline that as well. We've got a new target operating model. Fully agree with the discussion in terms of the funding model for the SABC, and we will execute whatever government obviously decides. If it is that government is going to be funding us more or fully, we will certainly align with that, and we will have strategies to execute on that. If the current funding model is going to be maintained, then all we're asking is that the playing field is level, because we have a public mandate and we have rigid regulations from ICASA, but the playing field is not level in terms of we then forced to see a DSTV, for example, as a competitor because we are competing for marketing and advertising space, basically, and revenue. So whichever the funding model is, we will certainly execute on it, but the playing field has to be level.
All right, please hold your thoughts, Mr. Plakis. We'll certainly touch base with you in just a moment after this break. Let's now take a quick break. We'll be right back. This is Unfiltered, and tonight we're discussing the SABC funding model and whether it is sustainable or not, or whether it is time to relook and rethink the SABC's funding mechanisms. This is Unfiltered on SABC News. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back.
I was on my deathbed due to COVID-19, working here at the SABC. Now you are telling me that my position is no longer available.
We cannot work at an institution that deals with information, and then we don't know our rights and our privileges. We don't know the laws of the country. SABC, their mandate is for us communities. It educates us. It's a democratic state organ. You cannot retrench in a state organ. That's nonsense.
These are just some of the employees who expressed their disgruntlement at the proposed, retrenchments at the SABC. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight, we are discussing what it really will take for the SABC to be turned around, if it ever will be turned around. And we're joined by the SABC Chief Operations Officer, Ian Plakis, as well as William Bird, who is the Director of Media Monitoring Africa. We also have the Deputy Board Chairperson of SAVA SABC, Mpondaba, as well as the IFP National Spokesperson. Gentlemen, let me welcome you back to this conversation. Now, what really, is causing so much consternation is what got the SABC to where it finds itself in, Mr. Plakis?
So, yes, we know what the history of the SABC has been in the past. And the PCC chair has adequately addressed that. So we've got a turnaround plan that was developed by GTAC. We are executing on that. And yes, National Treasury has set a precondition for us, and that is to reduce staff costs. And that can only obviously be done through a 189 process and alternatives that we have put in place. So as you know, we started off the 189 process with identifying about 600 positions, and we've reduced that now to 400 affected, with 170 positions that are vacant. So about the possibility of 230. However, with the additional alternatives that we have put on the table, such as voluntary severance packages or early retirement, that number of additional vacancies can grow, and so the number of impacted employees can be reduced substantially.
When the new group CEO was appointed, he promised to turn the SABC around. Do you still believe that he's still on course to that mandate, given the current situation? Is this what's happening now? Is retrenchment part of turning the SABC around? I mean, making 400 employees going hungry?
Okay, so yes, it is part of, and if you look at the turnaround plan of the SABC from a revenue perspective has been a 3-year projected one. So the current financial year that's just passed was about 511 million loss projected, basically. That's actual now. The projected loss for this current financial year was 350. That was prior to COVID. Obviously, we've had a major impact, not just our company, but the industry as a whole had a major impact. And so we're looking at probably 1.1 billion rand impact or loss now. And next year would be reduced and the outer year, and then we'd break even. So the organization obviously is looking at all 3 components, which is optimization, that's new revenue drivers. We've identified additional ones. We've started implementing that. If you look at, for the first time in the last 3 years, we actually have a sellout on our prime time slots. For the first time in a long while, we've actually broken through the 400 million rand revenue mark in terms of generating revenue through advertising costs, basically. So there's definitely improvement. So during COVID, that advertising revenue decreased to about 20-30%. We are meeting 80% of our monthly targets now. So there's definitely an improvement. Yes, part of the GTAC report and the strategy in the turnaround plan was to reduce staff costs. And that's exactly what we are executing on as well.
All right. Mr. Mpondaba from the SABC and as well as Mr. William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. I'll touch base with you in just a moment. We have to take an ad break now. This is Unfiltered on SABC News. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to The Filtered on SABC. Thank you so much for joining us. This is where the show will end on SABC 3, but then it does continue on a sister channel, SABC News Channel 404. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, I'm joined by Mr. William Bird, who is the Director of Media Monitoring Africa. We also have the Deputy Board Chairperson of the SABC, Mpondaba, as well as the IFP spokesperson, Mkhuleko Hlengwa. Tonight, we're discussing what would it take for the SABC to be turned around, if it ever will be turned around. Now, Mr. William Bird, let me bring you into this conversation. I mean, so much has been said and done about whether the SABC should be run as a commercial entity. But does a public broadcaster, Mr. Bird, not supposed to get more in order to fulfill its mandate to the public?
A very old debate. I mean, if we go back to the ANC's resolutions in 2010, over 10 years ago, they were talking about proper sustainable funding for the public broadcaster from the public purse. They just haven't acted on that. There's been no political will to really do this, and you just keep postponing things until you end up in the kind of crisis that we see now. And the critical thing is who the people that lose. It's the employees of the SABC, and that is what we're seeing here. You know, years and years, decades of thinking you can get away with the same old model and not doing anything. You know, until the last couple of years, we saw no effort by the SABC, or virtually no effort by the SABC, to shift to digital. And yet, if you look at what's happening to broadcasters, public broadcasters around the world, they're having to face the fact that their models are no longer sustainable. You know, the BBC went through massive retrenchments, I think about a year ago now. It's very similar to cases in many of the Scandinavian nations. So these things aren't unusual or unique to South Africa. What is unique, I guess, is the fact that we are now playing catch-up for things that we should have started to do at least 10 years ago.
I mean, the SABC, since it broadcasts to mostly the lower LSMs, that might not necessarily be a catalyst for delivering revenues. How then does the SABC ensure sustainability without, of course, compromising the quality of its product?
But that's exactly the point. You know, the SABC is there to meet the needs of all the people in South Africa and their mandates. It shouldn't be about whether or not you're an attractive LSM that means that you're a sustainable audience. You know, that kind of approach is just offensive. And it's precisely because of that that the SABC is in this very difficult predicament. So we do need, more sustainable public funding, and we need to be imaginative and creative about how we get that. There are lots of ways. You know, we've got lots of clever people in our country, and there are lots of ways that we can do these things. What's needed is real, meaningful political will to actually implement them, and then for the people to have the skills to go and implement those new funding mechanisms, and then for the SABC to say, how are we going to address and meet the needs of a changing South Africa and an increasingly digital South Africa?
Now, Mr. Mpondaba, are you of the view that the SABC is adhering to its mandate currently? I mean, the SABC board has always been at pains trying to defend its strategy and trying to defend if and only if it's still, fulfilling its constitutional mandate of providing high-quality news to the public. I mean, how is the restructuring likely to impact on the public broadcaster, specifically its public mandate?
I mean, I think Mr. Pletches would speak to that, particularly when it comes to the stuff that has to do with the day-to-day functioning of the institution and ability to, for example, produce content that is engaging and meaningful and meets really the interests of South Africans and everyone really. I think the question really should be, whether what we are seeing is not a deliberate attempt to make the SABC become unable to meet its mandate, because you earlier indicated that you then have the lower LSM and the inability to, for example, cater for all of them. What that entails or indicates rather is that the SABC is not going to be able to meet its mandate, whether it's in terms of language, whether it's in terms of information dissemination. I don't think it's something that entirely rests with the institution itself, but rather reflects the lack of political will. If we are to get to that point where there's total blackout, I don't think it would entirely be something that we blame on the SABC. I think political parties, particularly the ANC, considering what William also spoke to, the resolutions that have not been carried out, they have to take responsibility. So yeah.
But then should it be run as a commercial entity? And if so, will that not perhaps, infringe on the public mandate?
Well, I mean, the debate has been there, and it exists even in academia, whether public interest organizations such as the SABC ought to have advertising, for an example. But I think the context of South Africa is slightly complicated if you take into account the fact that government funding hasn't been there. You've had Kuleko speak about 3%. Then what that does is that it opens up the institution to potentially exploring other avenues of trying to gain revenue. So I think, we then would have to have a cost-benefit analysis, whether the choice becomes to not get advertising at all and let things be as they are. And the consequence would be that the SABC would not be able to function, considering the fact that even the fact that there's low adherence to paying TV license. So the debate, it's a necessary debate. However, if the government was showing up, it would be something that is worth exploring and its consequences, of course.
Mr. Plucky, the SABC has been around for quite a while now, and in its state of existence, it delivered high-quality broadcast, and it did very well in terms of revenue collection. But then the wheels started falling off over the past few years. Is it fair to say then, or is it fair to assume that the SABC is probably making employees scapegoats for its corporate governance failures?
No, not at all. And I think Williams summarized it very well. It's not just the SABC that's going through this. In terms of broadcasting, all around the world is experiencing this. If you just look at what has happened with the print media, just post-COVID as well. So we are not the only industry. If you look at digitization, we are in the heart, the industry is in the heart of the digital vortex. And any company that finds itself in there will experience transformational pains. And so this is not unique to the SABC.
I mean, why are we still having this debate? Because Mr. William Bird has conceded to the fact that this is an old debate, and as well as Mpondaba, as we just heard, said that the debate has always been there. Why is the debate always on the shelves? Why isn't no implementation?
A good question. Obviously, you're asking the wrong person. So from our perspective, a debate doesn't help us at all. We are facing the reality of the situation and the impact of whatever the decisions are made. And once again, we say, if it's going to be public funded or hybrid or whatever, that's fine. If we have to compete commercially, we are ready to do that as well. And we are certainly able to do that as well. But we do need to then look at the policy regulations and the reforms required to level the playing field.
And a huge chunk of the SABC's revenue collection model is the license collection. Has the SABC perhaps failed to collect license fees, and any new initiatives perhaps to collect license fees?
Yes, I mean, as you know, there's a 70% default rate, so we definitely have failed in that aspect. The reasons are multi-causational. It's definitely not an affordability thing. We have explored models, for example, working with DSTV for them to collect the license on our behalf. As you know, our subscribers would not pay a television license, but they would subscribe with DSTV and pay a monthly fee of 110 Rand. So it's not about affordability. It's about finding other ways, creative ways of collecting the license fees on our behalf, and certainly look at other revenue models as well.
All right, let's leave it there for now. We'll touch base with you in just a moment. But for now, let's take a quick break. And Unfiltered will be back shortly thereafter.
We also need to make sure that we cater for the Nguni-speaking people in the province. We must also report on their issues.
We have been reporting for over 10 years from a very, very volatile province. Everybody knows KwaZulu-Natal and the areas that we've been through. We've risked our lives, we've worked day and night. We've gone into areas where there's been political violence, just so that we can continue in our mandate, and that is to tell the story of the people of this country. And I think worst of all is the experiences that we've had on the ground as journalists. You know, there have been times where we've not had data. There have been times where we've had to drive 6 hours to a story and 6 hours back because we had no accommodation, because we were trying, because of austerity measures. I've literally been in austerity, I think, since I've been in this company.
These are some of the SABC employees stationed at the different parts of the country voicing out their dissatisfaction at the proposed retrenchments at the public broadcaster. Let me also engage Mr. William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. Mr. William Bird, there's a perception out there that the current management and as well as the board, they do not have the necessary expertise and the know-how to run a broadcast entity.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, they're the board. They were duly appointed by Parliament. They went through a parliamentary process. The interviews were broadcast live. As far as I'm aware, most of those people have demonstrated extensive experience either in working in the public sector or in working around media and broadcasting. So I'm not sure that is a fair or legitimate comment to make. Also, if you look at it, it's not like you've got, several other public broadcasters that you can just draw an extensive pool of people from to say, okay, well, now you're going to shift over here and report here. So if you're saying, do you have people that have gone through a fair public process of appointment where people have been able to look at their skills and say, well, are these people the right kind of people to take us there? Then yes, that is clearly the case. So I don't think that that's a fair comment. Does it mean to say that they have done everything perfectly and all of that sort of thing? No, clearly, of course not. You're talking about a massive institution where gossip isn't just a part of it. It's entrenched in the very structure of the building. You've got an institution that's relatively new to the extent that we're a new democracy, but it has a very, very long history of, apart from that, where communication wasn't something that was practiced widely in the institution. You've then had a period of 15 years at least prior to this where management was not interested in communicating and engaging with workers. They were playing whatever other political games they were interested in. So suddenly you then say, well, okay, now in this amount of time, we want to completely change institutional culture that is over 80 years old, and we want to change the way that this thing functions. I mean, that's setting yourself up to fail. Can you say that there have been some significant achievements and significant victories of this particular board? Yes, you can, clearly and unambiguously. One of the biggest turnarounds we've seen as MMAs is when we looked at the monitoring of the media's coverage of the SABC's coverage of elections in 2016, and you compared that to 2019. It was chalk and cheese. I mean, significant difference and improvement in the way that the SABC have been covering it. The fact that we can now have these engaging discussions, the fact that the SABC has been broadcasting strongly critical coverage of its own senior executives, strongly critical coverage of anyone there, and that there's been no sanction as would be appropriate on any of them, that talks to the fact that this is an SABC that is still finding its feet. They're able to express themselves. There's not like anyone's going out and saying, well, no, you're not allowed to strike now and you're not allowed to say these things. Not at all.
Well, in as much as the SABC continues to face, an uncertain future due to the crippling financial crisis, it does appear, though, that the board is continuously and continually ignoring political pressure and union threats. Should they ignore the political pressure that has been coming from all fronts, and should they continue standing their ground without any form of interference?
So look, it's one thing to say, should they ignore that advice and that pressure? I don't think that they have at all. It's clear that they've listened to that. It's a very different thing saying that this board is independent and they will make the final decision on the SABC in whatever direction they choose to saying that if someone who's of a senior political view comes in and says, you must actually do this, that they say, okay, thanks, we definitely will do that. It's not so they must make the final decision. Of course, they must meet with the ministers. They must meet and engage with the unions. This is what unions' job is. They must meet, they must engage, they must see how they can find some kind of common way forward. But it's a very different thing saying that as opposed to saying, well, they must just give in and allow interference. Interference is a very different thing. When they talk about interventions and we're going to do this, that is when you undermine fatally the independence of the public broadcaster.
Mr. Mkhuleko, I think I'm going to pose this question to you as well on the issue of interference. I mean, the SABC has, for the past few years, there's been talk of political interference at the public broadcaster. Do you think that the board should continue standing its ground and push on its mandate to retrench 400 workers without any form of political interference?
The board should not take a political decision. It's going to have to take decisions based on the merits and demerits of its business case. And therefore, any political interference which comes its way will in itself be undermining a public broadcaster, which over the years has been characterized as a state broadcaster. The political interference which you speak about does not only extend to the board. There's political interference in the newsroom. There's political activism in the newsroom. There's politics in the SABC generally. And so that is also something that we have to fix. The independence of the SABC must not just be cosmetic. It has to be real. And the demonstration of that realness is to allow for the SABC to be run like a business, but also understanding that the public mandate must not be compromised. And so that is why we keep going back to the fundamental question as to whether the government as a shareholder has been able to meet its own commitments and responsibilities. And so for so long as that question is not resolved, and we're going to have problems. It's one thing to make political statements and make political assurances, but you've got to put your money where your mouth is. And the fundamental challenge here, Simpiwe, is that SOEs across the spectrum are in dire straits. There is a fundamental collapse. SAA has received a 10.5 billion rands bailout. It probably needs more than that. We've seen the trajectory of Eskom. So ultimately here, you are dealing also with a complete and utter failure to manage SOEs on one hand, but also on the other hand, boards whom have to find themselves time to time benchmarking against political decisions. And that is very, very dangerous. What we need is to allow the space for SOEs to function wholly without interference. The second point is that the bailout of 3.2 billion rands again came with terms and conditions. It was therefore irregular to only have the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies and Employment and Labor in the absence of the Minister of Finance to actually come in to address these very real and pressing issues. And so we need to take the fight to where it actually resides. The other issues which are prevalent at the SABC...
We are pressed for time, unfortunately. Please be as brief as you possibly can in your responses. And do you also get the sense that the concerned stakeholders are committed to an amicable solution to the current impasse? I mean, seemingly the board is at odds with the stakeholders on the question of restructuring. How does Parliament move to ensure that we do not revert to the crisis of board changes at the SABC?
Well, amongst other things, it's pulling this debate out of the shadows and having it honestly, and for Parliament to look at the budget correctly in the national interest, because this is a national question. The issue of tensions is healthy in any democracy, and there has to be contestation, of course, of views between the SABC and its employees. That has to happen. And fundamentally, that is why we are calling for an independent mediator on this matter and a consultant who's going to be able to bring the parties together. The board cannot, in good faith with its executives, be a player and a referee in a manner that affects them, but also at the same time, the employees of the SABC have to face the facts of the very serious realities of the financial collapse of the institution that they work in. And so the coming together of minds to bring about mutual solutions is something that has to happen. We have to save the SABC, and saving the SABC means saving as many jobs as possible. But the restructuring that is taking place is a consequence of years of mismanagement and government failure. And again, government now is failing to actually sort out this mess. And so they themselves are conflicted because they're taking political decisions on the other hand, but unable to match them with financial commitments.
Mr. Mpundaba, I see you vigorously nodding your head as Mr. Mkhuleko Hlengwa is making his point there. Do you think that the current administration of the SABC, is failing to juxtapose political interference and as well as making sure that the entity is profitable?
Look, I think William did say that, and I agree with him and you, Mkhuleko, that it's not a question of interference. I think that's the wrong choice of word. I think it's about engagement. One that is democratic, one that is inclusive of stakeholders who have interest in this matter. The question of interference is it would cause havoc, to the SABC as a public interest institution, one that exists within a democracy. We've seen how broadcasters can be taken over, even in this country, particularly if we look at the history of interference within the SABC in the past couple of years. So I think what is necessary here is to ensure that all possible views are taken into account and that it's engaged with by people who are cool-headed, who are not going to try and advance different interests. Particularly, I'm talking about the political parties, the ANC in this case. They have to really, in the government sense, they have to show up and do what is necessary as per the commitments they've made throughout the years. I don't think, the board has to be independent. The engagement has to be fair and it has to be open. I don't think interference is necessary.
I mean, being the
ridiculous.
biggest broadcaster on the continent, very well resourced in terms of size and in terms of talent, what would it take for the SABC to be restored back to its former glory?
First, I mean, we would have to throw out interference out of the window. That's the first thing. The second thing is for government to carry out its obligations in terms of ensuring that the institution is funded properly and ensuring that then you begin, from the perspective of the SABC, as someone who's on the outside, it would have to position itself according to the changing nature of the sector, particularly when it comes to broadcasting. I mean, there are many changes that are happening locally and globally. So the institution has to respond to the current times, but I think the only way they can do that is when there's funds available for them to carry out that objective.
All right, Mr. Ian Plakis, your closing remarks as we end the show, and please be as brief as you possibly can.
Thanks, Mpiwe. Yes, I think it's important to correct the narrative in terms of the board ignoring political pressures and the unions. If that was the case, we would have exited the employees in August already, because that's what we could have done if we were to abide with the Labour Relations Act. The fact that we still go down the line shows that it's a board that cares for the sustainability of the organization and one for collaborative efforts in terms of reaching a compromise position going forward. And, the narrative that we have received additional funding this year is not true as well. The last funding we received was the bailout, and that was the last tranche was at the end of the last financial year.
All right, Mr. William Bird, your closing remarks?
Yeah, SABC, they need a plan and they need political will in order to carry that plan out. And once they've done that, you do it in a manner that is open, transparent. We've got enough really clever, intelligent, brilliant people at the SABC to make these kinds of things happen. We just need to make sure that they're given the space to make those things happen. And we need the government to come to the party and make sure that there's innovative ways of properly sustaining our public broadcaster.
Mr. William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa, Mr. Ian Plakis, SABC COO, Mr. Mpondaba, the chairperson of the SAVA SABC, and Mr. Mkhuleko Hlengwa, spokesperson for the IFP. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. We appreciate your time. All right, we've reached the end of tonight's discussion. So much, has come out of this discussion. I mean, we talk of interference or the supposed interference at the SABC. We also talk of the funding model of the SABC and whether the SABC should be moved as a commercial entity. Thank you so much for joining us. Till next time then, goodbye from Johannesburg.